What if I ever stayed in a hotel or a house where something really disturbing happened?
Hi guys, and welcome to the Stephen King Cemetery Club. Hi guys, and welcome back to the Haunted Valley. Today we are discussing part 3 of The Shining. So part 3 is The Wasp's Nest, and it starts with chapter 14, which is Up on the Roof. So we are 3 weeks past when we last talked, and it's the 20th of October. And Jack is on top of the roof trying to repair some shingles. So Jack is thinking about his play that he's writing. He's gotten back into it. He's being very productive. Quote, "He felt in a way that the play itself, the whole thing, was the roadblock, a colossal symbol of the bad years at Stovington Prep, the marriage he had almost totaled like a nutty kid behind the wheel of an old jalopy, the monstrous assault on his son, the incident in the parking lot with George Hatfield, an incident he could no longer view as just another sudden and destructive flare of temper." That's on page 119. So, as he is removing flashing, he finds a huge wasp's nest. It's about 2 feet across, and they are wall wasps. He gets stung by one, they're creepy, and he is sitting on the roof trying to make his escape. He's watching to see if more come out of this nest. And while he's up there, he's kind of reflecting on his life and what has happened over the last several years. And he admits freely to himself that he's an alcoholic and he has rage issues. So apparently ever since he was 7, he has been trying to control his temper. And there was a notable incident when he was 7. He was spanked for playing with some matches by a neighbor lady. So he was mad and he threw a rock at a passing car to vent his anger. His father saw him and his father beat him up, spanked him, hit him. And then Jack went from that. He was pissed off, and when his father went out of the room or whatever, Jack went and he kicked a dog into the gutter. So more dog abuse. Stephen King likes to put that in there. And from then on, he had numerous fights in grammar school and tons in high school. And he learned to play football as like an outlet for his aggression, but that soon turned into him getting really keyed up and being in a high state of agitation. So now we finally hear more about George Hatfield and what happened that led Jack to be forced to resign from Stovington Prep. So Jack had been off of alcohol for a couple months and he was easily irritated. He had a student in his class named George Hatfield who was kind of, I picture him the way that Hubble Gardner looked in The Way We Were, because he is described as a jock with kind of Robert Redford type looks. He, basically had a lot of, he was rich, he was popular with the girls, that kind of thing. And he joined the debate team because his father wanted him to. And he stuttered when he was worked up. And this caused the time to run out, because debates are timed, and he wouldn't finish making his points because he would be stuttering through a lot of it, which, ate up a lot of his time. So there was a time when he accused Jack of setting the timer ahead, and so they're having this fight. Jack kind of mocks his stutter, and he starts out reasonable, and then he is pushed to sniping and being defensive and pissy at the 17-year-old who's getting very worked up. He's very angry. And later, Jack thinks if he did set it ahead, it would only have been no more than a minute out of the 5, and that it would be a kindness in a way. So he cuts George from the debate team, and one day he leaves the school building and he sees George sawing at his VW Bug's tires with a knife, and Jack just sees red and loses his shit. And he he beats George pretty mercilessly. It was a situation that didn't need to happen, very unfortunate. So that is the reason that Jack was forced to resign, because he beat up a student. Chapter 15 is down in the front yard. Wendy says, quote, "This is the happiest I've been since we were married." That's on page 131. They talk about, if Danny is adjusting to the overlook or not, and Wendy decides to make doctor's appointments for all three of them. So they're going to go into town, get checked out before the snow comes. And Jack, who has killed the wasps with a bug bomb, has gifted Danny with this gross nest. Chapter 16 is Danny, and Danny is learning to read. So he has been reading these primer books, which are like the C. Jane, Dick and Jane, and Spot, whatever books. And he is reading and trying to learn, quote, "as though his life depended on learning to read." That's on page 135, which in certain ways it does, because Tony shows him all these signs and he needs to know what they say. So Danny has an episode in the bathroom. He's sitting on the side of the tub. He's staring into the mirror across the room. He's in a trance. He is unresponsive when his parents break the door down and come in. And he says, quote, "Roke, stroke, redrum," in this voice that's deep and not his voice exactly. And the way he is described, it reminds me of Family Guy. I don't remember who it was, but someone was saying, "What's wrong? Are we having a stroke?" Because they were looking at themselves during one of the cutaway moments, which we don't usually see. And they're sitting there all blankly staring at nothing, and it was kind of funny. So Wendy is slightly jealous. We've already heard this, that she feels like Danny and Jack sometimes exclude her. They have a bond that she just doesn't have with them. And after this incident, Jack yelled at Danny to snap him out of it, and Danny still, talked to him first, goes to him for comfort, that kind of thing. So he asks Jack to hang around before bed because he wants to talk to him. And Danny asks, quote, "You'd never hurt Mommy, would you, Daddy? Or me?" That's on page 141. And Jack reassures him, no, he wouldn't hurt anyone. This same night, Danny has a nightmare that something is chasing him and, smashing the walls with a mallet. And during this nightmare, he is stung by wasps. And I think he got 11 stings in all. And Jack is positive that he emptied this wasp nest of all the wasps, and he had used this bug bomb, which had sent up billows of smoke and chemicals, and there's no way that it didn't work. But somehow there are all these wasps that managed to come out of the nest, and they stung Danny, they stung Wendy a little bit. So Jack takes him out to the yard to just freeze overnight. And as he's heading back in, Jack thinks, quote, "And suddenly he found that he didn't like the overlook so well anymore, as if it wasn't wasps that had stung his son, wasps that had miraculously lived through the bug bomb assault, but the hotel itself." And that's pages 149 and 150. Chapter 17 is the doctor's office. The entire Torrance family has gone in for their checkups with Dr. Bill Edmonds, and Danny is talking with Dr. Bill, and he finds out from Danny, the doctor finds out from Danny, that Tony is at least 11 years old, but probably older, and he's only ever seen at a distance. So the doctor asks Danny if he can put himself into this trance, if he can make Tony appear. So Danny decides that he'll try. And as he is in the doctor's office going into this trance, we are privy to what Danny sees. And he sees a bathtub with something creepy in it, a clock under a glass dome. He hears church bell noises. There's also a mechanical noise, and Danny realizes, quote, "It was the thing that would be forgotten." And this is all on page 156. So it kind of reminds me of Stranger Things, when Eleven is in that trance, and she is in the dark, and there are just random objects, and it just looks so cool. So during this trance vision thing, Tony tells Danny, quote, "This inhuman place makes human monsters." That's on page 157. So the doctor basically thinks that Danny is flushing Tony out of his system, like he doesn't need him anymore, and Tony is showing him terrible things because he doesn't want to leave. Chapter 18 is the scrapbook. Jack finds a scrapbook on the 1st of November in the cellar. And it's just sitting on top of a pile of junk, and he happens upon it and he starts reading it. And a lot of it is about the hotel history, and one of the main people it talks about is Horace Derwent, and he had a big reopening of the Overlook in 1945, and there was a huge party, an unmasking party. And Jack is very drawn into this. He's reading this entire scrapbook. He really wants a drink. He keeps wiping the back of his mouth with his hand, which is a behavior that he used to exhibit when he was drinking. And in this scrapbook, one of the last things in it is a newspaper clipping of a gangland style murder. Vittorio Ginelli, who is known as the Chopper, was killed in 1966 with a shotgun, and his bodyguards were also killed. And this is what Danny had seen. The newspaper clipping has a photo of the brain matter on the wall and the blood of the presidential suite, and that is what Danny sees when he is in that room. And then written underneath the clipping is, quote, "They took his balls along with him." That's on page 177. So Jack has no idea whose scrapbook this is, why they are compiling all this unsavory stuff, and why he was so drawn to it. We don't know any of that, but very creepy. Chapter 19 is outside 217. So Danny has taken the passkey, he has stolen it, and he is standing outside of 217. Danny is outside thinking about this and the similarity to the story of Bluebeard, who offed his wives for being snoopy. And Danny gives up. He doesn't go into the room just yet, and he is ready to leave, and there's a fire hose in the hall that had already scared him before, and it falls off its little holder onto the carpet. And Stephen King can make a fire hose seem scary. The way that Danny and this fire hose are having this standoff, nothing really happens, but Danny is, thinking in his mind that what if it's filled with wasps? And that just reminds me of when I was little. I had a bad experience with Yellow Jackets. I got stung a ton of times. It was probably me who stepped on a nest when my cousin and I were hiking through the woods. Could have been her, I don't know, but I got stung a ton. Anyway, for a while I had this fear of wasps, yellow jackets, that kind of thing, and I was convinced that they were somehow going to come out of the bathtub faucet while I was taking a bath. Like when I'm just sitting in the tub, that somehow they would shoot out of there and get me. So this probably struck a nerve when Danny has this irrational thought that maybe the fire hose has these poisonous wasps inside of it and they're all going to come out and get me. So I thought that was interesting, that Stephen King can just make such mundane things seem kind of scary. Chapter 20 is Talking to Mr. Ullman, and Jack and the family are down in Sidewinder, and Jack has decided to look into the history of the Overlook Hotel because he's thinking about writing a book. So he is in the library and Danny's playing in a park. Wendy comes in to see what he's doing, and he's just excessively irritated with her. He has a headache, splitting headache, because the machine, the microfiche machine that he's looking at, is kind of making things distorted and it's making him squint. It's hurting his head, and he's very, very mad at her, just irrationally. So Wendy leaves to go back to Danny to give Jack more time, and Jack decides to go to a drugstore to use the phone. So he goes to the drugstore, he grabs a bottle of Excedrin, which is his painkiller of choice, especially when he was drinking. He used to chew Excedrin. And it has, quote, "a dry, bitter taste, but a compelling one." That's on page 191. So Jack calls up Mr. Ullman, who is working in that hotel in Florida that he manages during the off season, and he starts needling him. He starts like poking him about, you know, the history of the Overlook, and how dare he not tell Jack about how unsavory this past was, and the people who run the hotel have been shady and have had connections with the mob and just all this stuff. And there's a threat of, you know, Mr. Ullman takes the bait and he wants to fire Jack, and he says that, you know, if I thought for sure that I could keep my job, I would fire you right now over the phone. And Jack kind of throws it in Ullman's face, like, well, I don't think Al Shockley would like that very much. And then Mr. Ullman says, quote, "And I think you may have finally overestimated Mr. Shockley's commitment to you, Mr. Torrance." That's on page 193. So Jack has basically poked at Mr. Ullman, has told him he's going to write this expose about the Overlook. He does tell Ullman that he's going to write all this stuff down in a book and kind of expose the Overlook for what it is. Not that he's going to embellish, but that he's just going to air the dirty laundry, basically. And it's kind of like he is self-loathing and wants to be fired, because why else would he do this? Especially as he mentions that he is sober and he wrote down this phone number and planned to do this all day. Jack thinks to himself, quote, "It occurred to him that while he was fascinated by the Overlook, he didn't much like it. He wasn't sure it was good for either his wife or his son or himself. Maybe that was why he had called Ullman, to be fired while there was still time." That's on page 198. So it is possible that Jack has realized something bad is going on, and even though this is the end of the line for him and he can't just quit this job because he needs it, maybe if he causes such a stir, then he will get fired. Then the decision making is out of his hands in a way, and he could just be sent away. Chapter 21 is Night Thoughts, and Al Shockley calls Jack up and he's like, "What did you do? Why am I getting calls from the manager? You know, why are you doing this, for one? And for another, you know, I'm doing you this huge favor, and you are talking about writing a book, an expose of sorts, that is going to show my hotel, which I am connected to, in a very bad light. And, you know, we're friends, I got you this job, this is very ungrateful of you." So Al's conditions for Jack keeping his job: number one, no more calls to Ullman, and number two, Jack can't write the book. And Jack agrees. Jack is laying in bed and mulling over this conversation, and he is pissed off that Al, you know, basically laid down the law, and he's like doubled down. He's definitely gonna write this book, and it's gonna be well researched, and it's gonna have photos and all this stuff, and he's, you know, then gonna publish it no matter what he promised Al. And then Wendy is laying there thinking, because she's unable to sleep as well, and she's worried about Jack and Danny and worried about what the Overlook is doing to them. She has noticed, quote, "All of Jack's drinking symptoms had come back one by one, all but the drink itself." That's on page 204. So these symptoms are the constant wiping of his lips, the chewing Excedrin, the being easily irritated and kind of snappy, and then his bottled up temper. And then in another bedroom, in Danny's bedroom, he is also unable to sleep, and he feels like he is needing to protect his parents, like he has to keep watch over them. So once again, he's got this huge task that he should not have because he is so young. Chapter 22 is In the Truck. Danny and Wendy are taking a trip down to Sidewinder, and Wendy has decided that she needs to ask Danny straight out if the Overlook is bad for them. So Danny is curious as to what would happen if they didn't stay at the hotel, because he mentions that Jack needs the job. And she said, well, you know, we would have to go stay with your grandmother. And Danny just does not want to do that. He knows how Wendy feels about her mother, and he himself feels that his grandma kind of thinks that Wendy isn't doing a good job, and so all the stuff that Danny can pick up on, he doesn't like, and he doesn't want to stay with his grandma. So he says he would much rather stay at the Overlook and keep their family together. Wendy asks Danny if Jack has been drinking again, and Danny's response is immediate, quote, "No," he said, and smothered the two words that rose behind his lips after that simple negative, "Not yet." That's on page 215. So it's basically decided that they are going to stay. They're going to ride out the winter. Chapter 23 is in the playground, and this is happening while Wendy and Danny are going to Sidewinder. So Jack has stayed behind to trim the hedge animals, and he trims the belly of the rabbit hedge. Jack goes and takes a break in the playground area, and when he looks at the hedge animals, something looks different to him, and it takes him a while, but he finally figures out that the rabbit is now on all four of its legs, down on the ground. And before, the rabbit had been sitting on its two back legs because he was able to trim the belly. So these hedge animals are moving whenever Jack doesn't look at them. And anytime he looks back, he can see that they've moved. He can't keep his eye on all of them. There's a bull, a dog, a rabbit, and a couple lions. And they keep creeping toward him. They're very menacing looking with their posture. After a while, Jack reaches this breaking point, and he's kind of like, you know, I'm not going to believe in this. This is not happening. And he doesn't look. And then he opens his eyes, and everything is back to normal. Chapter 24 is snow, and we are getting this crazy snowstorm. And, quote, "The Overlook faced it as it had for nearly 3/4 of a century. Its darkened windows now bearded with snow, indifferent to the fact that it was now cut off from the world. Or possibly it was pleased with the prospect." That's on page 225. So the Torrances are trapped. They are stuck inside now because the snow is just falling like crazy. Chapter 25 is inside 217. So they are now snowed in, and the snowdrifts range from like 5 feet to 20 feet. So Jack has been spending a lot of time in the cellar still. He's finding weird little things in there. There was like a blood-stained sheet, like scraps from that he found. He found a poem, quote, "Madoc, are you here? I've been sleepwalking again, my dear. The plants are moving under the rug." That's on page 228. And as fascinated as Jack is with that little poem snippet, I am equally as fascinated. I find that to be so bizarre, and yet I find myself wanting to read more about it. So while Jack is in the cellar and he's looking through all this weird stuff that keeps cropping up the further back he goes, Danny has taken the passkey again, and he is standing outside of room 217. So he has kind of decided to put things to the test. He's going to see if things are like, you know, pictures in a book, and if he can go in and be okay in this room where something bad has happened. So he goes in, and he goes into the bathroom, and there's the dead woman in the tub, which I'm sure everyone knows about that. Even if you've never read the book, you've likely seen it in the movie. And Stephen King's description of this woman is so good and so disturbing. Okay, so Danny has gone in, he has seen her, he has backed away from the tub because he is freaked out by her appearance, by just the fact that there's something so visible there. And he has peed himself in terror, and, quote, "The woman was sitting up. Still grinning, her huge marble eyes fixed on him, she was sitting up. Her dead palms made squittering noises on the porcelain. Her breasts swayed like ancient cracked punching bags. There was the minute sound of breaking ice shards. She was not breathing. She was a corpse, and dead long years." So Danny takes off running. He is so terrified, and he gets to the door, and it's unlocked, but in his panic, he is trying to get out and can't. So he is having this kind of like breakdown, and he is just, his mind is snapped. Quote, "Time passed, and he was just beginning to relax just beginning to realize that the door must be unlocked and he could go, when the year's damp, bloated, fish-smelling hands closed softly around his throat, and he was turned implacably around to stare into that dead and purple face. It's on page 232. And that's where we end part 3, with Danny staring into the face of this crazy, gross, old, fishy woman. So, I love this book so much. Just the things that Stephen King plants in our brains, the terrifying fire hose, the terror of being so isolated, the terror of this gross woman who we thought was just going to be something that Danny could see, and we did not realize that the woman could move and the woman would be able to follow him. And the hedge animals, I mean, hedge animals aren't scary, but Stephen King can make it menacing and disturbing, having these things move when you're not looking. And even as someone who doesn't really believe in ghosts and spirits and stuff like that, just the idea of maybe there are people like Danny, so maybe I could have stayed in a room like room 217 and, I just didn't see anything, nothing happened. But if I was more like Danny, that same room could have something creepy and bad and gross in it. Anyway, we will do part 4 next week. Have a spooky day.